Today we're going to be putting the Bambu Lab A1 to the test to see if this 3D printer is truly deserving of all of the hype surrounding it as one of the best 3D printers on the market right now. First things first, let's get this machine out of the box. This printer was very kindly sent over by Bambu Lab for me to test out, but you know how it is on this channel, I don't hold back on any criticism I might have about a particular 3D printer. I always want these review and test videos to be a practical look at what these machines are capable of and what awesome things you can create with them. So in particular, this is the A1 combo, which means it comes with the AMS Lite, making this printer multicolor print capable, which is actually a first for me, so I'm very excited to see what kinds of new things I can make. In terms of how this printer is packaged, all of the AMS pieces are on top, which are all of these pieces that you see me pulling out here. And underneath all of that is the A1 printer itself, which the whole main printer is just in these two pieces. But now let's get to the fairly minimal assembly. We're going to start by turning the bottom part of the printer on its side, and underneath here you can see very obviously marked these red circles, and these are bolts that you need to actually remove. They're just there to keep the bed in place during shipping. From there, the next step is to combine these two main pieces. So I started by removing the cable that was kind of in the way, but then you really just click down that bottom section and then you can start removing all of these zip ties that are holding all of these cables and parts in place. Now, to actually attach the two main parts of the printer, we first need to remove this bottom panel and then locate these quite obviously labeled bolts that you're then going to install into these green highlighted holes. Honestly, the color coding and labeling on this machine makes it so easy to assemble. Once all of the bolts are installed, you'll need to replace the back panel before flipping this printer onto its backside so that you can access the bottom. The edge of the table works best for this. And here you want to plug in this group of wires that run from the hot end, which again are all very nicely color coded, so it's super simple to figure out where everything is supposed to go. There's also a clip to close for wire management as well as a bolt to screw in. Once that's all done, you can flip the printer back to normal so that you can pull the screen out, and then the last main thing we need to attach is this purge wiper, which just slides onto this end bit here, and then there is one bolt to screw in to keep it secure. Now this next piece is technically optional since my machine does have the AMS capabilities, and that is the spool holder that installs onto the top of the printer. If you're planning on using the AMS 100% of the time, then you don't really need to install this, but I want to use the A1 on its own first to see what the printer is like before we start diving into multicolor printing with it. I am still going to assemble the AMS right now so that I don't have all of these pieces on my desk, and this was again a very simple process. There are these 4 screws that go to attach the main section of the AMS to the stand, one zip tie to cut, and then it's just installing the spool holders onto the correct slot. So there are 2 green ones, 2 yellow ones, again color coded. They just push onto these poles that are sticking out from the main body of the AMS. And from there it was installing the lines. Now there are 2 short ones, 2 long ones. The shorter ones go to the side that's going to end up being closest to the printer, which is generally on the left side of the AMS, with the longer ones being on the right side, and this will end up being plugged into this back slot here. But again, we're going to be looking at this printer on its own first. The last thing I did was place the magnetic bed before booting this printer up. There's the typical start screen, language and region selection, setting up the Wi-Fi, and then it brings you to the screen to connect the Bambu Handy app if you want to. The next screen you're presented with are the calibration tests, which you will absolutely want to run all of these as part of a new printer setup. The first thing is, as far as I know, a Bambu Lab specific type of calibration, and that is a motor noise cancellation test. And what this does is runs the X and Y motors, so the motor that controls the movement of the bed and nozzle at various speeds, turning the noise cancellation on and off to, I guess, calibrate its optimal settings. And this was kind of difficult to capture. I didn't notice a whole lot of difference when the machine said it was turning it on and off until it got to the faster settings, and then you could start to actually hear a difference. But once it had cycled through all of that, the next test was a far more standardized test, and that is vibration compensation. It's a pretty self-explanatory test, but this is where the printer will move, again, the nozzle end bed at various frequencies and speeds to best help compensate the vibrations that the printer will be producing while printing, and counteract them so that the vibrations don't affect the print quality at all. The printer is still doing the test in this video, it's just vibrating so fast that the camera won't even pick it up. And the last of the tests is bed leveling. Again, pretty self-explanatory and standard amongst all 3D printers. When this test originally had its time estimate, which is very handy that there is the time estimate given for each of the different tests, when it said 15 minutes, I was pretty confused because, you know, you can see here in this sped up version that a bed generally does not take a super long amount of time to level. But then it went into like crazy leveling mode where it probes, I don't even want to think about how many points across this bed. It's like every so many millimeters. So it is nothing if not thorough. And once that had finished, that was the last of the calibration tests, which means this printer is all ready to start some prints on. The first thing I decided to print on this machine is in relation to this crazy stack of filament I've got going on here. Well, more specifically, these ones. These colors I could only get refills for, which absolutely amazing concept having filament refills, but they do need a spool to actually be useful, which brings us to amazing concept number 2, Bambu Lab's printable reusable spool. I'll have all of the models I print linked below, but a lot of them were from Maker World, which is Bambu Lab's own model website. It's basically completely integrated into their Bambu Studio slicer, so when you find a model you want to print, you can just click the Open in Bambu Studio button and it will automatically load into the slicer, which is very convenient. The one thing that you do have to pay attention to is the printer and filament that's automatically selected. It might not match up with what you're using, so make sure those settings get switched if necessary and you'll be good to go. So other than just making sure those two settings matched what I was going to be using, I didn't mess with any of the other slicer settings and just pressed print. This hexagon pattern is where you can really see that excessive bed leveling pay off. This was easily one of, if not the cleanest and most perfect first layer I have ever seen on a print. This is just one half of the spool, but first impressions of taking a look at this thing is it is a very clean print. A little bit stringy because this is PETG, but that's pretty much to be expected. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a non-stringy PETG print. And even that being said, the stringing on this is extraordinarily minimal. Now, while I was printing this, I did notice that I possibly should have started with some more A1 specific accessory prints. The first one being a side or poop bucket. So I started with that, and this thing was quite large, but printed so incredibly clean and smooth. And this just molds perfectly against the side here. There are so many options for these side buckets, and I would highly recommend printing one even if you're not doing the multicolor printing, because this machine still does purge a little bit of filament at the beginning of each print job. So having somewhere for that to collect and not just be flung all across your desk, which I did also print a deflector because this thing does fling it like crazy far. But just having somewhere for these little bits of filament to collect is going to clean up your workspace nicely. The next thing I decided to print was a better storage option for the filament swatch pack. Again, one of those absolutely genius things that I wish other brands would start doing, but there are so many amazing options out there for different types of storage for these swatches that this was one of the hardest decisions that I had to make for this video, but I decided on this spinning one because it was more compact while still being a really cool print and ultimately super functional for the swatches themselves. Normally the swatches are just held together by a string, which is pretty typical for different swatch packs, but this separates them all and puts them into this wheel, so you can still see all of the colors at a glance, but it displays them in this really interesting and awesome way that when completed, you can rotate and it will stick out individual ones. Here it's a little sticky, I had to work on it a bit. Some of the glass and carbon fiber filled filaments did not want to go back in their slots, but it is a lot smoother now, and this is a really awesome and functional 3D print. But now onto something extremely on brand for me, a droid. The awesome maker Astroaz teamed up with Droid Division to create this lovely little droid called an EC1, and I've been dying to print one. Droids always make really good test prints because they have a lot of different types of pieces, but I also wanted to try out the variable layer height feature. What this does is it gives you the option to increase or decrease the layer height depending on the amount of detail that any particular part has. So in the case of this dome, Most of the time, the top surfaces on curves can be really messy and noticeable. So here I am decreasing the layer height to like a 0.12 and even below that, which is what these green stripes are. And then you can hit the smooth button, which will smooth out the differences between layer height so it isn't so stark when this is actually printing. And then you can go in again on the side and to tweak that further. There is the like automatic one, but because I wanted the majority of this dome to still be at 0.2 layer heights, I just went in manually and chose exactly where I wanted the higher quality printing to be happening. You can of course tweak this the other way and increase the layer height if you want this print job to be sped up, but my main focus for this print was to try and print it at the highest quality possible, so I kept everything at least at 0.2 layer heights and below, which is what this dome ended up being, and this is an incredibly clean and perfect looking print. The top of the dome and curves were never going to be perfect, but the variable layer height definitely seemed to have increased the quality and smoothness of those top surfaces. The inside of the dome also printed reasonably clean, even though I didn't add any support material, but of course we couldn't just stop at a dome. We're going to need the rest of this droid. All of this was printed in PETG, by the way, and printing beautifully, might I add. These were some of the most flawless prints straight off of the printer that I have ever seen, and it being PETG is even more impressive. And this also wasn't even me messing with the temperature settings. I just selected the basic Bambu Lab PETG settings, did not touch anything else, and this was the print quality that I was getting. The only settings that I was modifying for any of this were just supports and infill and wall strength to fit my personal preferences, and before I knew it, I had an entire droid in a box. There were really only a couple of pieces that had any support material at all, which was mostly this dome, and the undersurface quality of these pieces looked really clean, all things considered, given that it's literally a straight overhang. And even though I do fully intend on painting this droid at a later date, I figured I better include a bit of a test build here so that you can actually see what this droid looks like all put together. Or even just having it resembling something closer to a droid and not just a box of pieces, albeit it was a very impressive looking box of pieces given how clean all of these prints looked. This is also a great test in print accuracy and seeing exactly how these prints fit together and if there were any fit issues, which there absolutely were not. There was just that little gap in the front because obviously one of the corners maybe lifted a bit, but other than that, everything seemed to have fit flawlessly together. Now, as much fun as these prints have been, I think it's time to finally start some multicolor printing. The first thing I did was load up my filament refill into my printed spool. There is a little notch on the side that you slot into the spool, and then you just sort of twist the two halves together and slide a clip in to fully lock it in place. Once that's done, you can start to remove the ties that are holding the filament together, and then you're supposed to sort of mush the filament all across the edges so that there's no gaps along the side so that it runs smoothly. There's even a sticker included in the box so that you can properly label your roll so that you know exactly what type of filament it is. This now brings us to the AMS hacks with Michaela portion of the video. I had no idea how I was going to figure out which line was what and make sure that they went into the hot end properly, so I grabbed this extra bit of filament that I had and installed it into one of the tubes, which you could actually see, so I knew 100% which line was what, no accidental mix-ups. Make sure when you do this you also do the proper cable management. And the last prep step I did was I actually bought one of these smooth plates, so I installed that on the printer and then have it run a bed leveling calibration. I don't know if that's exactly necessary, but I figured better safe than sorry. The first thing we're going to multicolor print are these amazing Uga's Cantina coasters. Seeing these a few months ago were the single project that made me truly consider wanting to multicolor print. So of course I'd have to make them first. So I started this process by loading up all of my filament colors into the AMS, making sure that they matched the filament colors in the slicer. And you can see here how the AMS has automatically read all of the specific filament colors that I loaded. Once again, for these, I did not mess with a single slicing parameter. I just made made sure that my machine lined up with the A1 that I was using, as well as the filament matched what I was using type-wise. So in this case, it was matte PLA. Yeah, did not want to mess with anything else and possibly mess up this multicolor print. So it started with red filament. And once the machine has finished everything on that layer in that particular color, it moves off to the right-hand side where it presses into that bit that sticks out, which is actually cutting the filament within the hot end. Then it then purges the remaining of that filament that's left in there out when it's changing the color. It is a fully automated system. It was so wild to see this thing work for the first time. So in this particular design's case, it's gone from using red filament to now black. Once it's done its purge cycle on the left-hand side of the machine, it goes over to the bed and starts to create the purge tower, which is essentially where the nozzle is priming itself so that by the time it gets to the piece that it should be printing, there's no issues whatsoever and you should be left with a flawless print. These were not settings that I messed with at all. I wanted to see how it would run with the standard Bambu Studio slicer settings, like whatever the defaults were, because I figured that's what all beginners, like, they would not start messing with this. So it is pretty universally considered a bit overkill in terms of waste. Like, it's really not necessary to be purging as much filament as it automatically does, or creating as large of a purge tower to still get the same flawless prints that this machine will do. And there's a lot of variance in how much you really want to be messing with the particular settings. A lot of it can still be automated, but you can minimize it quite simply. In these coasters cases, the multicolor printing was really only on the bottom 5 layers, so there wasn't a whole lot of waste involved in it, and after that point it then switched to the single color, which was black, where it finished off the infill and top surfaces. And here is how the first coaster turned out. This was like blowing my mind. I was so obsessed with how this looked. It printed really, really clean. The settings automatically had ironing turned off for the top layer, and this is what the waste ended up being. So not terrible, also not great, but the thing with multicolor printing is this one coaster did 17 filament changes, but if I multiply the same coaster by 4, it's still only does 17 filament changes. This is where you can start to also really make a difference in the print to waste ratio. In the coasters cases, you probably could have put 4 different ones on the bed and achieved the same less waste effect, but I have so many Star Wars loving friends that I knew I was going to have no issue finding homes for 4 sets of coasters. So 4 of the same coasters per bed was the plan of the tack, and there were 8 coasters total that I printed, and all of these prints were turning out absolutely amazingly. There were a couple here and there that had like a string embedded across them, but really clean overall. And then there were these extra design plaques for the ends of the coaster holder. Again, printed really cleanly and awesome looking. The coaster holders themselves were just a single color, so at the end of 8 total coaster sets, this was the waste produced. Given just the sheer volume that I 3D printed, that personally did not feel like a whole lot. Like, you can see here just how many individual things that were printed. This was again using the base settings that are pretty universally considered way too conservative, and later on I do change the multiplier factor, which pretty much cut the waste in half in terms of the purge amounts. But here were the finished coaster sets all put together. These were so awesome and impressive. Everyone that I showed one to in person like could not believe that these were 3D printed. These were awesome, but I wanted to try out a more 3-dimensional multicolor print, and this was pretty much entirely brought on by this amazing metallic blue filament, because I thought it looked like an absolutely perfect droid color. I know, 2 droids in one video, I feel like that's a new record for me. The EC1 print turned out so well that I wanted to see what one would look like multicolor printed. The first thing that you need to set up in your slicer are the filament colors themselves. Yes, I have 5 colors listed here, but only 4 slots, ignore that for now. But when you have your filament set and you go into the color painting tool, those colors will be there for you to select from. Personally, I basically completely stuck to the fill tool, and it was really easy for this droid since each of the panel areas would highlight themselves and show up without any issue, so I really could just choose the color that I want and then paint bucket it onto the area that I wanted it to be that color, and this was the final result. From there, you just load up all of your filament colors into the designated slot. 3 of these were not Bambu Lab filaments, so you just manually select which slot is assigned to what color, and then you're off printing. I have to say, brace yourself for this next clip because it's these 3-dimensional prints that really start to create the waste. In this particular print's case, half of it was my own fault because for some reason the inside of this piece was selected blue, so there were certain layers where it was literally changing the filament color 4 times when it really didn't need to, so that's on me. There was unnecessary waste created for that. But I suppose the exact same thing would happen to any beginner starting with multicolor printing. Even with all the filament color changes, these prints were not losing their quality whatsoever. These things looked absolutely beautiful, which of course is what you want because the entire idea of printing in color means that you're not painting this later on, so you do really want these prints to turn out flawlessly. About halfway through printing the pieces is where the 5th color comes into play, which all I did was flip out the white filament for this metallic black because some of the pieces didn't have white on them whatsoever. So there's not a single individual piece with more than 4 colors on it, but there are 5 colors total on this particular droid. And it just sort of accidentally worked out that way. I realized that I could use the black in the recessed areas to sort of mimic my weathering style, and it really made all of the panel lines on this droid stand out nicely. I did leave the dome print for last since it was one of the more nerve-wracking ones. It was one of the largest pieces, it had one of the largest color change filament counts, and again, this print turned out really awesome looking. The only piece that weirdly had any sort of issue was the top of the base. It ended up having this one little black spot on the surface. I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but other than that, all of these other prints were turning out absolutely perfectly. Since I wasn't planning on doing any post-processing or painting on this droid, I took my hot knife and just ran it across any of the edges that had more support material to try and smooth out any more rough areas. But that was really only necessary for a couple of sections, so from there I went straight ahead into assembly of all of these parts. Most of them I just pressure fit into place. There were a couple of the detail pieces that I actually glued together, but I didn't want to accidentally mess up the color or finish of any of these parts by accidentally getting super glue on them, and I also wanted this droid to remain fairly serviceable since I knew I would be adding lights into it later and wanted those to still be able to be accessed. So after adding some lights, wires, tubing, and mesh, this was the finished EC1 droid. I definitely do not plan on having multicolor printing replace any of my painting, but this was a really cool project to see exactly what multicolor printing is capable of on a project like this. Now that I've had the chance to more thoroughly put the A1 to the test, I wanted to sit down and give you my thoughts on this machine. First of all, I have to say, it has been a long time since I've had this much fun with a new 3D printer. I mean this in the most positive way, but this machine does kind of feel a bit like a toy. The ecosystem that Bambu Lab has created between their own slicer, model website, their own filaments that, when you feed them into the AMS, can be automatically recognized as to what filament has been loaded. Just everything as a whole is incredibly impressive and most importantly works, and works very well at that. It was important to me to see what the A1 was like on its own in terms of being a functional printer as well as the combo as a whole. The A1 as a 3D printer on its own is an excellent machine, really easy to set up. There's a lot of really awesome little features that Bambu Lab designed into the experience when assembling the machine that make it very beginner friendly. Print quality is of course excellent. Bambu Studio as a slicer is one of the best ones out there. We will get into the slicer aspect of things in a minute, but in terms of like in-house brand slicers, Bambu Studio I would rank as #1. Let's put it this way, it is the only brand developed slicer that I'm willing to use for any of my printers. If you're coming from the perspective of this being a really great beginner 3D printer, the slicer, pretty straightforward to use. It does have the toggle that you can switch on and off between advanced settings, which gives you more settings to see and mess around with, but I did not mess with any of the speed parameters or even any any of the temperature settings for the filament. The only things that I ever changed in the slicer were things like number of walls, type of infill. It kept on defaulting to grid infill. Please never use grid infill. If you want a strong infill, triangles is way stronger than grid anyway. I know some people really despise triangle as well because it still crosses over the path, so a lot of people have converted to gyroid, but just pretty much never under any circumstances do grid. Triangles is way better anyway. So while I do recommend looking at those settings and changing them to your preference as well as what might work best for the model, neither of those settings are something that should immediately lead to a print failure. So if you were a beginner, I don't think if you just, not changed anything at all, that it would be like a problem. But I guess this part is a good segue that I really wanted to hit on because it seems to be lacking from most videos that I've seen when talking about beginner 3D printers. The A1 is undoubtedly one of the best, if not the best beginner-friendly 3D printer on the market right now. But even though the machine itself is excellent at being able to do the job that it's meant to do, that still doesn't make up for needing to still learn the software end of things. And this is where I see the majority of people that start experiencing issues have problems. It is incredible that 3D printers are becoming more and more accessible to people that want to start getting into the technology. But because all of these 3D printers are being touted as like super beginner friendly, you've never 3D printed, this thing works like straight out of the box, there's just so many people that seem to be disregarding the fact that you will still, no matter what 3D printer you decide to start with, need to learn how to use the slicer software and needing to understand what the different slicer settings mean in terms of what that's doing to the 3D printer itself. The integration of MakerWorld into the Bambu slicer, where you can literally just press print from one of the pre-made profiles that like the designer of the model has used for that particular print, are great. But if that's what you're relying on all of the time, you're going to be crazy limited for the stuff that you can make. If you're somebody that is brand new to 3D printing and end up with a super low hassle machine like the A1, you are still going to need to learn what the slicer settings do and what they all mean. I don't want this to come off as like gatekeepy at all, because I think it's amazing that so many new people every single day are considering looking at getting into 3D printing, and I'm glad that people getting into 3D printing today aren't going to have to deal with the numerous headaches that would come with old machines, like even just from a couple of years ago. Beginners need to understand that even if you buy what is touted as the best beginner-friendly printer on the market, or even just the best 3D printer on the market currently, it will fail you if you aren't willing to learn the software side of things. And I will say, with the entire Bambu Lab ecosystem, it is definitely one of the easiest transitions to learning the various settings that are important. Like I said, I never messed with any of the filament specific settings or speed settings for the machine itself, and that wasn't even using 100% Bambu Lab filament. I really wanted to make a point trying out this machine with non-Bambu filament. Bambu has very specifically profiled out each individual one of their filaments, and even using the Bambu Lab specific filament profile for like the closest equivalent to whatever I was printing with worked great. So there's like one giant thing solved that you never have to worry about. Speed settings were another thing, never messed with those. Really leaves the only thing that beginners need to educate themselves on being infill type, wall settings, and support settings, which support settings generally pretty easy. I never messed with the settings themselves. It's just kind of remembering when you need to turn them on or off, and also possibly making adjustments to where they are, but it's more of I take supports away depending on the piece and not so much adding them. So somebody starting out probably doesn't want to mess with that. It just means a beginner, if they were not messing with the support settings at all, they're like wasting more filament on support. It's not going to equal failed prints, which is probably the most important metric when it comes to people starting out in 3D printing. On the same topic of waste, now that I've thought about it, the only other slicer setting that I changed was the multiplier setting for the like color change for the AMS. As a default, it is set to 1, which is a pretty universally considered overkill in terms of filament color change. I believe I originally set it to 0.6 and then I decreased it to 0.5 and never had any issue in terms of color bleed. Again, that's a pretty easy setting tweak. It is not the difference between a successful and failed print though, it's just saving you on the amount of wasted filament, which of course is a very important thing to consider. And another thing that I wanted to touch on. I tried to see if I could find out like a specific difference between the two, but the AMS light I keep on seeing people say is a whole lot faster than the standard AMS that you can use with like the X1 Carbon, P1S, all of the like boxed Bambu printers. It makes absolute sense considering the differences with how the two AMSs work between the machines, that the AMS light would be a whole lot faster for changing filament colors. I just couldn't find out a specific time or like time range of how long the traditional AMS takes. When I timed the AMS light, it took just over a minute to switch the filament colors. And I suppose that will vary slightly depending on how much filament it is calculated that it needs to purge. Because if it's going between two dark colors, it purges less because there's not going to be a very noticeable color difference between the two. But if you're going between like white and black on a certain layer, then it purges a whole lot more. So that's going to increase the color change time. It seems like the AMS light is the preferred version of the AMS in terms of multicolor printing. I believe it's also being determined that there's less waste between the two AMSs, again, just probably because of the differences of how they work. For the AMS light, you have the 4 tubes going into the hot end, whereas with the traditional AMS, you have the 1 tube that it's feeding the filament in and out of that single line. So it does kind of look a bit crazy back here, but it was working flawlessly for me, and it was really impressive and exciting to see multicolor prints for the first time in my workshop. Of course, the main project that I focused on for a multicolor print was the droid back there. Now, as somebody that is constantly 3D printing, I do try to be very conscious of the amount of waste that I'm producing because of the various things that go into this hobby. For the sake of this video, I really wanted to color that droid in whatever way that I wanted without compromise to the amount of waste that I could see that it was producing. Which the good thing is, Bambu Studio will calculate the estimated waste for each color so you can like see it all in numbers to see how good or bad of an idea something might be. And I will say some of those calculations were very painful for me to hit print on, but again, I wanted to show you for the sake of this video the amount of waste that something like that will produce. So this bag is all of the purged filament that came from that entire droid. Of course, there are also the purge towers that are part of the whole color changing situation, but it is the purged poop, as it's frequently referred to as, is the real waste metric, I guess we could call it. Now, I don't really know if this is more or less than I was expecting for an entire droid. Like, it is one of those things that I like had mentally prepared myself that there was of course going to be waste when you start multicolor printing. So I guess you let me know whether you think this is a lot more or a lot less than you would think would have gone into that droid. There were certain color design choices that I made that I knew were going to produce a lot of purged filament. The second that you have a layer that has multiple colors, you're looking at multiple filament changes per layer times however tall that area is. So the bottom greebly bit on the booster of that droid had recessed lines that I decided to do black, so it kind of mimicked the weathering that I probably would have put on it had I painted it. Every single layer for like that much in the print was changing the filament like 4 times, which is basically what all of this like black and dark filament here is. So yes, this isn't a bag because I do fully intend on doing something with this waste. So yes, you really do have to keep in mind that there can be a lot of waste when it comes to multicolor printing. In comparison though, the coasters that I printed, because it was a flat design and the color changes were condensed to like 5 layers only, it meant that through the entire print of each like coaster that I printed, it only changed the filament like 17 times total. So it was pretty minimal waste-wise, especially when you start looking at multiplying the same things over over and over, which is a really good way to minimize the waste as much as possible, because if you make multiples of the same thing, then it's doing the same amount of filament changes and essentially wasting the same amount of filament. Not super applicable for a droid where I could pretty much only fit the one piece on the build plate at a time, and also because the color changes were very three-dimensional in this print. Like, some of the pieces on this droid had like 300 filament changes, which meant there were 300 little bits of plastic to be added to this bag, which I know people really love to try and cancel people that multicolor print on the internet. But something that you do have to consider is, even if you're printing in a single color, all of the support material that you're using to properly print a piece is also waste, and I don't see a whole lot of people complaining about that. I suppose it is because support material you really can't get around. It is a lot of the time the difference between a failed and successful print, whereas multicolor printing is like a completely optional step to be taking. But it is something to keep in mind when you do see the waste that goes into multicolor printing, that even single color prints are still producing waste, you're just not viewing it in the same way. Personally, I don't see myself doing a whole lot of projects like that droid with so many different filament colors. It's going to be like a very special occasion project, or if I'm making a print for somebody, and it is something that I'm going to try and continually dial in to see if I can even further decrease the waste produced from the different filament changes. But the coasters for me were a great balance between being able to see what multicolor printing can do for a project and like the quality that it can produce these projects at, but also not being overkill on the waste factor. And also, of course, there's the time increase that goes into all of the color changes. You know, if we say that each color change takes about a minute, when you're looking at 300 color changes, you're adding 300 plus minutes onto a print job. I'm excited to look at other projects to multicolor print, of course with an extreme emphasis on it being reasonable in the waste department. And of course I am also going to be looking at trying to further reduce the waste that is produced with all of the different color changes for multicolor print projects. It is also a really great size in terms of beginner 3D printer, or just 3D printer in general. It's 256 millimeters cubed, which means you have a lot of wiggle room in terms of the types of projects that you can be printing on this machine. It isn't quite a helmet class size printer. I'm sure there are some smaller helmets and masks that you might be able to fit in one piece on this machine, but I would say probably like 90 to 95% of the pieces that I print for any of my projects would fit on a printer of this size. I'm sure I've already mentioned it in this video, but I cannot stress how much I love the concept of refillable options for spools. Even being able to have the option to 3D print your own spool to be able to put refills onto is just so great. I know it might be a little thing to some people, but when you 3D print a lot, there's just so many empty spools that I know a whole lot of people have no way to properly recycle. I'm lucky, and where I live, I've never had an issue recycling them, but in a lot of cases, they do unfortunately just end up being more waste associated with 3D printing. And the refills are also cheaper than having to buy the whole thing, so it's just a win-win-win situation overall. So I really hope that even more filament companies start getting on board with the refill idea. Even though I had a great experience with this printer, I did want to mention a couple of things. The first thing is the camera. Now, it's pretty unheard of that a bed slinger style printer like this has a camera like automatically built into the machine, but in this printer's case, it might as well not. I've seen a lot of people complain about the placement of the camera. It's like right here on the side, so it like faces this way on the printer. Yes, it is a bit of an awkward angle to be viewing the progress of your prints on, and I know a lot of people have modified it slightly that push the camera out forwards more so that you have more of like a straight on view, but honestly it doesn't matter because the camera is barely functional. When you view it on the app or even within the slicer, it has like a 1 frame rate every 20 to 30 seconds maybe, which apparently is due to the processor not being able to handle a higher frame rate on the A1. This entire printer and printer ecosystem is so well thought out and planned and so amazing that the camera is like an extreme severe letdown. This is not the most important thing to be worried about by far on a 3D printer, but it is kind of like, if the camera was going to be so barely functional, maybe you should have just not included it on the machine. But one of the first times that I decided to remotely view the printer's progress from the camera, I'd never seen the slow frame rate, and the camera caught the bed moving like right at the exact moment. So for a while, since the frame rate was so low, I thought the print had failed because like the whoosh of the piece on the print bed looked like it was spaghetti. It was not a great first impression for the camera. Yes, I guess technically it does its job because you can look at it and see its progress every 30 seconds maybe, and it is there if you're into time-lapse recordings of your prints, but personally I think it might have been better to just leave it off the machine entirely. The only other thing that I wanted to mention is, I guess again, more of like a personal preference thing or recommendation for future printers maybe, and that is in regards to the build plate. The A1 comes with the textured PEI sheet, which does work great, but when you're looking at multicolor printing, there are a whole lot of prints that do the multicolor printing on the bottom of the print. So you really want that first layer to be as flawless and smooth as possible, which is why I decided to buy the smooth PEI sheet for this machine. There are so many prints like that I would say that the smooth PEI is almost a necessity when it comes to multicolor printing, which is why I think it would have been really awesome to see the A1s ship out with the dual-sided PEI plates. It has the smooth on one side and the textured on the other. So that would have been the best of both worlds, that the build plate that already comes with the machine would have been able to work for any of the types of print projects that you'd be looking at doing. If you are somebody that is considering picking the A1 up for a multicolor printer, then I do highly recommend also picking up the smooth PEI plate. It's not that the textured one would produce bad looking prints on the bottom surface, but I think most people that are looking at making a multicolor design that ends up being on the bottom layer, they do probably want that layer to be as smooth as possible and not have that dimpled texture that textured PEI plates will leave on the bottom of prints. Again, it's not one of those things that's incredibly affecting the machine itself, but it is something that I would have really loved to see be a part of this printer. And hopefully it is something that Bambu Lab would consider doing for future machines, is packing them with those dual-sided build plates. So to wrap it up, I think the A1 on its own is an excellent beginner 3D printer. Very easy setup, just works straight out of the box without any tinkering whatsoever. The slicer is amazing. The entire ecosystem is really awesome and is a whole lot of fun to use and work with, which might be a big bonus for a lot of people. If you are somebody that already has experienced 3D printing and is maybe looking at upgrading their machine, this is of course an excellent 3D printer on its own, but you are paying for the ease of setup and the entire ecosystem. Where I do think it becomes more appealing for a more experienced maker is the possibility of it being a multicolor printer. If you are somebody that is wanting to look at getting into multicolor 3D printing, or just want to have that option in their workshop, then I think this is definitely the printer to do that. The A1 combo with the AMS light, there's like no learning curve going from 1 filament to 4. I guess technically the most difficult aspect would be making sure that like the right lines that are labeled are going to the right inputs on the hot end. But yeah, that's basically like a non-issue, and it can be very easily fixed if you accidentally switched up one of the lines. Another thing that I always like to touch on is the community aspect, which there is of course a huge community surrounding the Bambu Lab printers. It means that as a beginner, if you run into any issues, there is a whole lot of people on various forums and Facebook groups that you can reach out to and can help you, because there's so many people that also own the same machine as you and know how to fix those problems or give you some tips on how to improve certain things. There's also a lot of accessories and customization options available out there, since so many people own these printers. You know, between the deflector and the waste spin on the side. There's just a whole lot of printed accessories and parts for these printers that can be a whole lot of fun to customize your machine with. Overall, the A1 and A1 combo is an absolutely amazing 3D printer that if you are somebody that has been considering picking one of these up, I don't think you would be disappointed at all in your choice. I had an absolute blast 3D printing everything on it, and I cannot wait to continue using it on projects in the future. If you'd like to find out more information about the A1 or A1 combo, there will be links in the description box. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.